the way it currently stands, forced labor, slavery takes precedence over rehabilitation and public safety.
Oh, by the way, while the Biden administration gives reparations to everyone but free people, look at the billions he has run over to Ukraine.
We don't have black grocery stores because if you think about it now, just to get in that supply chain, it's almost unheard of.
They don't want the truth to get out. Okay? I don't want to know what my family did or what all these people did and all this stuff like that. Okay? You read that 500-page report.
There's this thing called white superiority and black inferiority. That mindset allows all of the behaviors that we've seen across generations, allows for the construction of these policies and practices and systems and structures that continue to oppress us. This is not a handout. This is a debt that is owed.
You know, Allensworth was like the internet of his time in 1904, 1905.
The total black population in California is about 2.6 million, and then of that, the descendants compose about 2.2 million of that. So California, with a multi-billion-dollar surplus, can absolutely afford to satisfy the international terms for reparations, beginning with compensation.
Any financial obstacle that exists that impedes the success of increasing financial prosperity needs to be dealt with and eliminated.
No matter where we've been, no matter what part of this fight we've been in, we've been harmed, and we've had harm done to us specifically.
When I got to Los Angeles, this was some of the worst segregation I'd ever seen. And remember, I'm telling you, I'm from Mississippi.
Because as you can see, I'm giving you broken history right now, you know? But I had to give it to you guys today. I said, no, I got to show them this because it's so precious and nobody really knows about it.
Black people don't have that kind of luxury. Our historically black communities have been redistricted multiple times.
Now listen, if you can't handle the TR roof, don't tune in.
What's up, fam? What's up, fam? Chapter 6 of the California Reparations Task Force Report, Marathon Read, Monday through Friday, 8:30 p.m. PST, right here on Interim Mass Media Group. This chapter is Separate and Unequal Education. All right, before we go on, though, this Sunday, Interim Mass Media Group will be having a special report. This Sunday, 10/16/2022 at 11 a.m. Once again, we're going to have a special report of In the News. So if you're available, please like, share, and subscribe. And as well, we're going to have a midterm madness program, October 23rd at 11 a.m. Going to be going over some of the California ballot proposition and candidates here in California, and some other important state races as well outside of California. So definitely tune into that as well. Hopefully that will be informative, and we would appreciate the community's support and participation in that. So on that note, let's get started. Let me turn the music down just a tad, and then we will get into it. All right, cool. Here we go. Chapter 6, Introduction. Nationally, a quality education is the foundation for a good job, income growth, and in the words of the Supreme Court of California, for the preservation of the rights and liberties of the people. During slavery, the government of the United States of America at all levels, including the government of the state of California, deprived generations of African Americans. Well, I think it says deprived 11 generations. So let's just say it says 11 generations of African Americans of the benefits of a quality education. After slavery, governments in the United States required nearly all black children to attend segregated schools with far fewer resources and funding than the schools white children attended. In many schools today, these separate and unequal education conditions continue for black children. The benefits of a good education, a better job, and higher income build up over generations. Just as benefits mount and increase, so too do the harms. For hundreds of years, governments at all levels in America have inflicted compounding educational harm upon black children, and they have never made sufficient amends. During the slavery era, in order to control the black enslaved people who toiled to build the wealth of this country, enslaving states denied education to nearly all enslaved people. Free states of the North and Midwest segregated their schools and limited or denied free black access, with rare exceptions. African Americans could not go to college. After the Civil War, Southern states and others on the borders denied equal education to free black people to maintain a servant class and prevent black people from voting. Until 1945, state governments legally segregated black children in principally one-room schoolhouses with fewer resources and funding than white schools. White terrorist groups, supported by government officials, destroyed black schools in the rest of the nation. Government-supported housing segregation and neighborhood-based school assignment policies sent most black children to schools that were separate from white students and unequal with respect to both funding and resources. Most state-funded and private white colleges and universities refused to admit black students. The Supreme Court's landmark 1954 case, Brown versus Board of Education, which outlawed school segregation on paper, did not mark the end of segregation. As some Americans believe, many white government actors throughout the country aggressively resisted integration, shutting down public schools, harassing, threatening, and terrorizing black students and parents who sought to integrate schools and providing vouchers for white students to attend newly created private schools. In the rest of the country, government actors created and preserved school segregation through housing segregation and neighborhood-based school assignment policies. Today in America, the vast majority of black children remain locked into unequal schools and classrooms, separate from their white peers with regard to higher education. Predominantly white colleges and universities slowly increased the number of black students attending for about 40 years following the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. However, in more recent years, the overall number of black students attending college has declined. California. Before the Civil War, California also denied education to African Americans or forced them to attend segregated schools with far fewer resources and funding than the schools white children attended. For a period of time, California law provided state funding only based on the number of white children in each county, and also allowed public school districts to refuse to teach black children even in a segregated school under certain circumstances. Although California law officially ended segregated schools for black students in 1890, as in the rest of the nation, government officials created less obvious but equally effective policies to keep black children in mostly black underfunded schools. Today in California, many black students continue to attend unequally funded, under-resourced, and highly segregated public schools due to government policies that continue to segregate many schools and school funding by neighborhood. Recently, California has tried to provide a more equitable funding system by providing more state money to school districts that serve our poor students. However, the system does not ensure that the money is actually spent on those students, many of whom are black children, and in some evidence that this is a reason that black students continue to be the lowest performing subgroup in California. Section 2 of this chapter describes the laws, policies, and practices during slavery, which denied education to African Americans. Section 3 focuses on the period after the Civil War to the present and the laws, policies, and practices that created the segregated and unequal primary and secondary schooling experienced by the vast majority of Black students to this day. Section 4 describes how laws, policies, and practices denied African Americans equal access to higher education. Section 5 of this chapter describes how our nation excludes the experience of African Americans when educating our children and the resulting negative impacts. Section 6 summarizes the ongoing and compounding harms suffered by African Americans. 2. Denial of education during slavery. All right, real quick interjection. Hopefully they'll talk about this in this chapter and the following chapters, but if they don't, for those that don't know, check out the language, the Tut language, because some of our ancestors that were actually enslaved had to create basically an offshoot dialect of English in order to learn English, basically. So it was a derivative from English that our ancestors, are very advanced thinking ancestors, created a language called Tut language. So anyway, we shall continue. Racist pseudoscientific theories about the false inferiority of African Americans spread in the decades before the Civil War and justified prohibiting their education. Most enslaving states formally outlawed the education of enslaved African Americans, so enslaved people who sought to learn to read and write had no choice but to do so in secret and at great risk to themselves. While African Americans were enslaved and banned from schooling in the South, their labor helped pay for public schools in some states in the North. Schooling available to free African Americans in the North was mostly in segregated schools with fewer resources. At several schools that attempted to provide integrated education to African Americans, white Americans subjected teachers and students to threats, harassment, and terror. In California, for a period of time, laws intended to enforce segregated schooling also withheld state money from schools that taught Black children and allowed schools districts to deny education of Black children altogether under certain circumstances, even when local governments provided money and resources to support Black schools, while schools disproportionately received greater funding and resources. America's leaders promote racist pseudoscience. Facts. Here we go. In Notes on the State of Virginia, Thomas Jefferson proposed that Black inferiority in the endowment of both body and mind might be an unchangeable law of nature. Some scholars argue that Jefferson's statements became an important first document of racist scientific theories that were popular in the decades before the Civil War. Some of the so-called race scientists graduated from elite North colleges and claimed that Black people were subhuman and not descendants of Adam and Eve to support, as one scholar argues, the self-image of the nation's white supremacist majority. Even Abraham Lincoln also believed that white people were superior to Black people. Let's rewind. Even Abraham Lincoln also believed that white people were superior to Black people, stating in his famous debate with Stephen Douglas, "I, as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race." Pause. All right. Other early leaders of America, including Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, and Benjamin Rush, a founding father who has been called the father of American psychiatry, endorsed these false ideas about the inferiority of African Americans that served to justify education prohibitions. Scientists later proved that these race scientists were wrong in the racist theories used by government officials and private citizens to justify slavery and discrimination. See also Chapter 12, Mental and Physical Harm and Neglect, which discusses studies finding no biological difference between Black and white people. A recent 2019 Education Week survey suggests that these racist theories live on among America's teachers today. The survey found that more than 40% of American teachers incorrectly believe that genetics is a slight factor in explaining why white students do better in school than black students. Wow, what is up with these people, man? They are crazy. Anyway, thanks everyone for joining. What's up, Darlene? How you doing? Let's get back to it. The South. During more than 250 years of slavery, state governments prohibited education of African Americans except for certain religious education. In fact, the institution of slavery depended in part on enslaved black people remaining uneducated. Frederick Douglass, former enslaver, forbade him from learning to read as a N-word should know nothing but to obey his master, to do as he is told to do. Most enslaving states formally outlawed teaching an enslaved person to read or write as early as 1740. Enslaved people caught learning to read or write in states where this was outlawed could face prison, public whipping, or be threatened with having a finger or arm cut off. When religious education was permitted, it generally taught enslaved people basic reading but not writing, because learning to write could help an enslaved person escape. That is true, interjection, but we also have to think about reading and then learning how to write. You know, I mean, you could sign off on your own contracts. You're not just signing that X, so you know exactly what you're writing. So anyway, back to it. Some enslaved African Americans sought out instruction provided in secret. For example, Douglass secretly taught other enslaved people how to read and describe the work of instructing my dear fellow slaves as the sweetest engagement with which I was ever blessed. We loved each other, and to leave them at the close of the Sabbath was a severe cross indeed. Ashe to Frederick Douglass. As a result of such secret lessons taught by enslaved people, free African Americans, and some white Americans, about 10% of African Americans in the South learned to read by 1865. The rest of the country. In the North, African Americans were more likely to have basic reading and writing skills. African Americans sometimes attended schools that were mostly segregated either through government policy or local practice. In some places, state and local officials prohibited African Americans from opening schools, and white Americans harassed and threatened teachers of black students until they stopped teaching. In some places, white Americans also vandalized or destroyed schools that permitted black students to attend. For example, in 1832, when a white school teacher in Connecticut named Prudence Crandall began enrolling black students in the small school that Crandall ran out of her home, white townspeople forced her out of her own home. Shout out to Prudence Crandall. White parents withdrew their children. Crandall eventually enrolled 20 black students. On May 24, 1833, the Connecticut legislature passed a, quote, black law, end quote, prohibiting any school from teaching a black student from outside of the state without permission. Local officials arrested Crandall because she kept her school open. She spent the night in jail and charges were brought against her. Then in January 1834, vandals set the school on fire. Crandall finally closed the school in September 1834 after white townspeople broke 90 panes of glass on her home using iron bars. This was the second unsuccessful attempt to establish a school for black students in the state. While African Americans were enslaved and banned from schooling in the South, their labor helped pay for public schools in some states in the North. Enslaved people worked for free in the South picking cotton, and their labor in the South created great wealth for the textile manufacturers in the North. By the early 1830s, New England mills consumed large quantities of cotton from the South. 78 million pounds of cotton fiber per year, that the United States became the second largest producer of textiles in the world. This textile industry in the North paid taxes. These taxes helped to fund the public schools in New England. During slavery, Due to government policies and local practices, very few black students were permitted to attend these public schools, even though the labor of African Americans enslaved in the South helped fund them. I'm going to repeat that again. Very few black students were permitted to attend these public schools, even though the labor of African Americans enslaved in the South helped fund them. During this time, the federal government also supported enslavers kidnapping African Americans in the North who had escaped from slavery to re-enslave them in the South, where they were again denied education. See Chapter 2, Enslavement, for further discussion of related issues. During the 1800s, black students generally could not receive an education beyond high school because it was legal for colleges and universities to refuse to admit black students. In response, free African Americans, often affiliated with black churches, established the first black colleges and universities. Shout out. Until the early 1900s, these schools mostly offered middle and high school level education to African Americans who had been prohibited from attending school. By the eve of the Civil War, only 28 of the nation's nearly 4 million newly freed enslaved people had received bachelor degrees from American college. California. California became a state in 1850, a decade before the onset of the Civil War. Despite the anti-enslavement clause in California's Constitution, enslavers brought several hundred black enslaved people to California and generally denied them education. The early California legislature, dominated by white Southerners from enslaving states, revved the school laws to enforce segregated schooling. See Chapter 2, Enslavement, for further discussion of related issues. These state lawmakers successfully enforced segregated schools to deter racial intermixing. California State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Andrew Jackson Mulder, who served from 1857 to 1862, stated, "If this attempt to force Africans, Chinese, and the diggers, Native Americans, into our schools is persisted in, it must result in the ruin of our school." As early as 1855, California enacted a law calculating how much the state of California would fund a school in proportion to the number of white children in each county, so that local governments could not receive any extra money from the state when they taught a black student. Superintendent Mulder later influenced a California law in 1863 that withheld state funds from schools that taught black and Chinese children. So, although California taxed black people to pay for the state's public schools, black California's taxes only paid for the education of white children. Rewind. Black California's taxes only paid for the education of white children, and they had no right to education for their own children. Okay. Dang. Reparations now. This is ridiculous. All right. Let's get back to it. All right. Because of both of these laws, local governments, instead of the state, pay to educate non-white students. Further, those local governments that ran schools for black students generally provided less funding and resources for black schools in comparison to white schools. For example, 6 years after the first all-black school was established in 1854 in the basement of a San Francisco church, the San Francisco school superintendent George Tate stated to his school board that the room occupied by the school for the past few years is disgraceful to any civilized community and was squalid, dark, and unhealthy. In 1864, the state changed the law to allow school districts to provide education of black students in a segregated classroom or school if requested in writing by the parents or guardians of 10 or more school children. Of 10 or more colored children. This meant that if fewer than 10 students have lived in the district, California law also allowed public school districts to refuse to teach black children at all. In 1866, the state changed the law again to allow white parents to prevent black students from attending their children's school, if a majority of parents objected in writing. Because of the state laws, black children were forced into separate public schools or out of the public school system altogether. In response, black women in Sacramento, Oakland, and San Francisco led efforts to organize church-based schools, private schools, and separate freestanding public schools. In the mid-1860s, black students across California were also generally denied access to public middle and high schools. Few public middle and high schools existed at the time, and California refused to fund and provide separate public middle and high schools for black students, in part because of the 1864 state law that permitted school districts not to provide a school where black students were few in number. Section 3, Unequal Primary and Secondary Education. Nationally, formerly enslaved African Americans had a fundamental belief in the value of literate culture, and this belief was expressed through their efforts to secure education for themselves and for their children. For the first decade after the Civil War, African Americans and the politicians they elected successfully fought for and built the South's public school system through a series of legislative and constitutional enactments. Prior to the concerted leadership of freed African American leaders, none of the southern states had a universal public education system. As black political leaders passed laws and set aside funding to create a public education system for all children, black students could attend schools in their communities. However, government expansion of schooling for illiterate African Americans threatened white economic domination. According to J.L.M. Curry, an Alabama state legislature in 1889, education would spoil a good plow hand. Let's repeat that. An education would spoil a good plow hand. So even as educational opportunities for black people in former enslaving states expanded after Reconstruction, white-led governments and organizations created a web of government-approved policies and tactics, including burning schools down, to continue to deny black people education and maintain legalized school segregation. So even though African Americans led the creation of the public education system in the South, white students ultimately benefited far more than black students. Denying education or quality education to African Americans was also critical to denying African Americans political power and maintaining white political supremacy. For example, most former enslaving states suppressed the black vote by imposing a literacy test for voters and selectively enforcing it against black people. See Chapter 4, Political Disenfranchisement, for a further discussion of this topic. The vast majority of the policies and practices that created unequal and segregated schools for African Americans in the South lasted another 100 years. Many continue to live on today in different forms. African Americans led the creation of the Southern public education system. Let's repeat that, family, shall we? African Americans led the creation of the Southern public education system. Boom. In the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, the vast majority of black people lived in the South. Formerly enslaved African Americans identified education as essential. Black-dominated Reconstruction-era legislatures in the South passed laws to create the public education system in the South. The whites in the South had always regarded the public school system of the North with contempt. The black freedmen introduced and established it, and it stands today a living testimony to his faith that education is necessary to social welfare. said Colonel Richard P. Hallowell, Union Army and Pennsylvania Freedmen's Relief Association. Ashe, Colonel Richard P. Hallowell. Shout out to the freedmen. Black men recently allowed to vote and hold political office helped draft new state constitutions in the South that mandated public education. All right, let's go back again. Black men recently allowed to vote and hold political office helped draft new state constitutions in the South that mandated public education. Shout out to all the family writing legislation right now, standing on the shoulders of giants. Maureen Simmons. Shout out to Maureen. And also, shout out to Marcus Champion. All right, let's continue. During Reconstruction, they served on federal and state legislatures that passed the bills to provide funding to the new schools. Black political leaders worked in interracial political coalitions with white Republicans, generally poor whites or northern transplants, to establish the South's universal public school system. Okay, let's repeat. They just didn't say just the black public school system. They said, interjection, they said the South's universal public school system. That means everybody, I believe. If I'm wrong, let me know. Let's continue. What historians have called the crown of Reconstruction, the Freedmen's Bureau Act of 1865 also helped set up some schools for Black people who had been newly freed, although the federal government ended the Freedmen's Bureau Act after just 7 years. Despite this setback and other obstacles, and even after federal troops withdrew from the South in 1877, African Americans who already knew how to read and write shared their knowledge with others in their communities. When, as described further below, Black communities did not receive the necessary funding from post-Reconstruction white government officials to afford to pay teacher salaries, African Americans sought financial assistance and teacher recruitment from federal agencies and benevolent organizations in the North. Given the unwillingness of white property owners to rent or sell to African Americans and the refusal of white-led post-Reconstruction governments to properly fund schools, African Americans also struggled to access buildings that they could use as schoolhouses. Nonetheless, Black communities worked together to overcome these obstacles. Since most African American churches were owned by African American congregations, churches were often utilized as schoolhouses. Local residents often gathered together to apply liquid slate to the side walls of the church to create chalkboards, to also use these buildings for schooling. From 1908 to 1968, some of the 100 plus Black teachers in rural communities in 13 states, whose salaries were funded by a Northern philanthropist, utilized their positions not only to teach Black students, but to advocate for improvements to their schools, public health, living conditions, and teacher training. Influential educators such as Nannie Helen Burroughs, a Black woman who was denied a teaching position at a public school in DC, decided that if she could not get a job as a teacher, she would start her own school. Shout out to Nannie Helen Burroughs. Burroughs refused to rely on white donors and instead relied on donations from community members, which enabled her to establish the training school for women and girls in DC by 1909. All right, so let's put this in the chat real quick. All right, let's do this. Although Burroughs' school taught vocational skills as well, her school differed in that she assisted women in becoming politically and financially autonomous in order to empower Black women to be public thinkers and not just public doers. Boom, 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 boom. public thinkers and not just public doers. Interjection. Black people, African American people, freedmen, we need to be more thinkers. We need to be doers too, don't get it twisted, but we need to think. All right. So thank you for thinking and coming and getting this information. I'm learning too as well. Okay. So thank you once again. All right. As a matter of fact, quick interjection again, and we'll get back to it. I am humbled right now because I know how to read. But if it wasn't for my ancestors who sacrificed themselves, right, to create these public education systems from nothing, right, I wouldn't even be here reading today. So let's just, take a quick second to give all praises to the ancestors. Let's get back to it. The persistence and enthusiasm of African Americans created schools for African Americans within their communities when white-led Southern government refused to fund them. Racial terror. As discussed in Chapter 3, racial terror after federal troops withdrew from the South in 1877, for the next century, government officials supported private citizens who terrorized African Americans and Black institutions with impunity. White Americans burned a number of Black schools and churches housing Black schools to the ground. White American-led post-Reconstruction governments closed Black public schools and fired Black teachers. A unanimous Supreme Court effectively authorized the elimination of high school for Black students. The unanimous Supreme Court effectively authorized the elimination of high school for Black students. Hundreds of thousands of Black youth and adults were essentially re-enslaved on trumped-up charges upheld by federal and local judges and police, and forced to labor for white-led U.S. companies and plantation owners under conditions that were as brutal or even more so than those endured during slavery. A number of those re-enslaved were preteens and teenagers. Some were children under the age of 10. They were not enrolled in school. The unpaid labor of these re-enslaved African Americans also built wealth for white-led companies and plantation owners. See Chapter 11, An Unjust Legal System, for further discussion of related issues. Segregation by law. From the mid-1860s to 1954, legal segregation laws operating in 17 former enslaving states forced African Americans into segregation and unequal schools. By the 1880s, a series of U.S. Supreme Court cases had several limited the federal government's power to enforce Reconstruction civil rights legislation intended to protect African Americans, leaving enforcement in the hands of white-led state and local governments. This cleared the way for the Supreme Court in 1896 to endorse the idea that requiring African Americans to be, quote, separate from whites is in nearly every facet of life could be consistent with equality. During the long period of segregation, African Americans attended schools that were intentionally under-resourced and structured for the purpose of maintaining a servant class. The same African Americans were forced to donate additional land and money to support Black schools because the state did not send enough money for Black schools. For example, when in the 1930s, a fire destroyed classroom furniture and equipment in a Louisiana school, according to a local newspaper. Oh, my bad. Hold on a second. All right, let's go back. After the purpose of maintaining a servant class. Double taxation for Black schools. Let me see. In class. Let me just make sure I've got this right. To provide for the S. Okay, yeah. Double taxation for black schools. After Reconstruction, white former enslavers created a slave state tax system designed to underfund education for African Americans. Some states ordered that schools for black children be paid for exclusively by taxes on black parents. In these states, no white taxpayers paid for the education of a black child, but African Americans paid for the education of both black and white children. This dual tax system created huge differences in the amount of money spent to educate black and white children. In practice, this meant that many African Americans in the early 1900s had to pay double to receive less in education. In southern states, the disparity could be as high as $10 per white student for a single dollar given to fund a black student's education. In the 1930s, a local school superintendent in Louisiana reported bluntly, "We have twice as many colored children of school age as we have white, and we use their money. Colored children are mighty profitable to us." The same African Americans were forced to donate additional land and money to support black schools because the state did not send enough money for black schools. For example, when in the 1930s a fire destroyed classroom furniture and equipment in a Louisiana school, according to a local newspaper, the city refused to pay to replace any of the destroyed items. Instead, the tax dollars were given to the white school, and black parents would have to raise the money to repair the school. Man, Louisiana. I think, interjection. I think Louisiana needs some reparations too. What do y'all think, fam? All right. Inferior resources, funding, and time. By the late 1890s, African Americans in former slaveholding states had been shunted into their own inferior schools through an unfettered grab by white supremacists, according to one historian. The schools they attended were often in terrible condition and lacking in basic facilities, such as desks and chairs and working windows. These schools generally included fewer grade levels of education. White school authorities intentionally selected the least qualified teaching applicants and pushed a curriculum focused on industrial work. For example, canning, sewing, and woodworking. In May 1911, after completing a study of the conditions black schools across the South, W. Du Bois concluded that the state of segregated elementary schools for African Americans in the South and in border states in a deplorable condition, worse off than 20 years prior, with poorer teaching, less supervision, and comparatively few facilities. The disparities in funding were also severe. White schools received an average 5 to 8 times more government funding than black schools in nearly all former enslaving states. In the 1930s in Louisiana, black teachers and principals made an average only 43% of what white teachers and principals made, $499 a year compared to $1,165. Similarly, in Mississippi, black teachers and principals made just $250 a year, while white teachers and principals made $630 a year. For black teachers, as Isabel Wilkerson, shout out to Isabel Wilkerson, writes in The Warmth of Other Suns, this meant even the most promising of colored people, having received next to nothing in material assets from their slave foreparents, had to labor with the knowledge that they were now being underpaid by more than half, that they were so behind it would be all but impossible to accumulate the assets their white counterparts could, and that they would, by definition, have less to leave succeeding generations than similar white families. In addition, the number of months black students attended school was generally fewer than white students, 4 to 5 months in comparison to 6 to 8 months for white students. The causes included lack of sufficient funding for schools in rural communities where many African Americans lived, white farm owners forcing black children to work in the fields, or their sharecropping parents needed assistance, and government limits on the number of months that a black school would be funded in comparison to a white school. Despite the inferior quality of black schools, some prominent thinkers such as W. Du Bois suggested that integrated schools would ultimately disadvantage black students because of discrimination that they would inevitably continue to experience would prevent African Americans from receiving a proper education. He wrote that separate schools were necessary for the proper education of the Negro. Moreover, he believed that race prejudice in the United States was such that most Negroes cannot receive a proper education in the white institutions. Because the proper education of any group of people requires sympathy, understanding, and social equality between teachers and their students. In his 2004 article in The Atlantic, Ta-Nehisi Coates recounts the story of Clyde Ross, a student who was encouraged to attend a more challenging black school outside of this community built with funds from a philanthropist and resources amassed by black community members, who also donated physical labor to actually build the schools. The school was too far away from Ross's home for him to walk there and get back in time to work in the fields. Local white children had a school bus, but Ross and other black children did not. Thus, Ross lost out on the opportunity for a better education. For many black students, the school that Ross was encouraged to attend was the first ever available to them in their community. In yet another way, African Americans paid twice. They devoted funds and their own labor to build a school for their children while also paying taxes that supported better schools for white students. Thank you for that, Darlene. Appreciate you. What's up, Theo? How you doing, fam? Thanks for coming through. Shout out to Kim for reading. What's up, ADOS Truth? What's up? All right, let's get back to it. In spite of the concerted state efforts to deny them equal education opportunities, black Southerners achieved a literacy rate of 43% by 1890, a rate of growth that far surpassed the rise of literacy in Spain and Italy during the same period, and that continued to rise in nearly all Southern states in the early 1900s. Wow. Yet, researchers have found that the legacies of slavery, compounded by the many obstacles that black children face in acquiring education, show a correlation with high rates of illiteracy among African Americans nearly 80 years after slavery ended. Resistance to integration. In 1951, black students led the fight for desegregation. And in 1854, the Supreme Court declared race-based segregation in public schools unconstitutional in its Brown versus Board of Education decision. Although many Americans believe that the Supreme Court's Brown decision was the end of school segregation, it was not. After the Brown decision, all across the country, many white Americans in white state and local governments refused to implement the court's order, while the federal government failed to adequately enforce order and protect black teachers, school administrators, and students. In former enslaving states, white-controlled government school boards in state and municipal governments almost universally refused to comply with Brown in what historians have called the era of massive resistance. On May 12, 1956, 90% of the South's congressional delegation signed the Southern Manifesto, pledging to fight integration using any means at their disposal. These lawmakers and others in the South states made good on their promise. Some white Americans in the South used violence, harassment, and threats to stop integration. they attacked black students and terrorized some black families who dared to enroll their children in white public schools. For example, in Arkansas on September 4th, 1957, when 9 black students went to enroll in Little Rock's all-white Central High School, Arkansas Governor Orville Fabius ordered the Arkansas National Guard to form a blockade around the school's front door to keep the students out. The National Association for Advancement of Colored People had to get a federal court order to make the National Guard stand down. But even with the court's order, the students were still not safe to enter because of the threat of white mob violence. Only after Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Ashe, sent a plea for protection to President Eisenhower did the federal government act. The federal government brought in 1,000 Army paratroopers and ordered the National Guard to provide an escort for the students as they entered the school. 21 days after the 9 black students, now known as the Little Rock 9, shout out, first tried to attend the high school, they were finally able to enter. As they walked in, angry white crowds of students and adults yelled racial insults and threw objects at them. Rather than allow integration to go forward in other schools, Governor Fabius then closed all public high schools in Little Rock for the 1958 to 1959 school year. Throughout their time in the school, the Little Rock 9 reported enduring severe harassment, including physical violence from some white students. Several years later, on the eve of graduation, the home of Carlotta Walls, one of the Little Rock 9, was bombed by white supremacists. I'm going to repeat that again. Several years later, on the eve of graduation, the home of Carlotta Walls, one of the Little Rock 9, was bombed by white supremacists. In Mississippi, when then NAACP Civil Rights Attorney Derek Bell filed a lawsuit to integrate one community school, he described how night riders came through the community firing guns into black homes. Golly, man, what is wrong with these people? African Americans who signed petitions to integrate the schools lost their jobs or had their credit cut off by the merchants. Because of the severe intimidation and harassment by the white community, only one black family was ultimately willing to send their child to the white school. When the child, Deborah, arrived at school, a large crowd jeered and marshals had to escort her into the school. Deborah's father lost his job the same day, and white Americans attempted to burn their house down. Southern states also passed laws to close both white and black public schools, deny state money for any schools that integrated, and provided vouchers or freedom of choice to over 3,000 newly created private schools for white students. For several years, black students in certain areas in the South had no school to attend at all. In Georgia, Governor Herman Talmadge, who fiercely opposed public school integration, told the public at a press conference that the only solution to a public school segregation ban was abolition of the public school system. The Supreme Court also contributed to the slow progress of desegregation. When asked to decide how quickly school districts across the country must desegregate, the Supreme Court answered that schools could do so with, quote, all deliberate speed, end quote. I don't know what that means. Interjection. Let's continue. One federal judge who heard cases filed by African Americans challenging the failure to desegregate schools for almost 10 years concluded that the effect of the Supreme Court's decision was to sacrifice individual and immediate vindication over the newly discovered right of blacks to a desegregated education in favor of remedy for more palatable whites. Because of all of these government acts, legal schools segregation in many places in the South continued into the 1960s and little segregation of schools took place. In 5 Deep South states, 1.4 million black school children continued to attend a segregated school until the fall of 1960, when integration efforts finally began. All right, fam, I'll take a quick pause. I will be back in like literally 1 or 2 minutes, but I will be back to continue reading. All right, let's go. Mass firings of black educators. Federal government and court failure to adequately enforce the Brown versus Board of Education decision and other negative consequences. Southern states engaged in a mass firing of black teachers and administrators without cause to prevent a white administrator and teachers with the same or overlapping position on a black administrator or teacher at the newly integrated school from losing their job. In 1955, a federal government staff attorney responded to the first of black firing of black teachers, stating that in a war, there must be some casualties, and perhaps the black teachers will be the casualties in the fight for equal education of black students. One black educator affected by the firings told researchers that in his community, the Teachers College for African Americans was closed in the name of integration, and many of the professors who taught there were required to go to teach in the high schools. The president of the black college was given a central office to do nothing position, and then someone with a master's degree, a white high school principal, was named president of the newly desegregated Teachers College. Mass firing of black educators deeply affected the economic, social, and cultural structure of the black community because many middle-class black people served in education. It is estimated that black communities lost millions of dollars as a result. For example, in 1970 to 1971, the black community in 17 southern states lost an estimated $240 million in salaries. The mass firings also have had long-standing repercussions, as the presence of black principals and superintendents remained disproportionately low across America in relation to the number of black public school students. Studies show that students who have teachers who look like them do better in school than those who do not. Black students with at least one black teacher by third grade are 13% more likely to graduate high school and 19% more likely to enroll in college than black students who had no black teachers. However, about 80% of teachers and principals and 90% of superintendents nationwide are white. Black teachers represent just 7% and black male teachers represent just 2% of the teaching force. Yet, 15% of the public school students are black students. Many black students will go through their educational careers without having a black teacher. Other government implemented tools to segregate schools. Whereas in the South, legal segregation laws prohibited black students from attending schools with white students. In the rest of the country, government actors largely use different but nearly as effective tools to create segregated schools for black students with less funding and resources. First, federal, state, and local housing segregation policies, including redlining and restrictive covenants as described in Chapter 5, Housing Segregation, forced the vast majority of African Americans to live in separate communities from white Americans. School and government officials then assigned black and white students to attend different schools based on where they lived. In this way, segregated schools were created and maintained. Let's see. The schools that black students attended then received less funding and resources than the schools that white students attended. This occurred because public schools generally obtained a large portion of money from local property taxes raised within the city where the schools were located. As a result, the amount of funding for the school depended on how much I think it meant to be say how much it could be raised or how much could be raised. Okay, there it goes. On how much could be raised by taxes in each local segregated community. The more expensive, the more properties in a school district, the more money a school district receives. When the federal government, along with private actors, devalued black-owned properties through redlining, they also locked black students into schools that received far less funding for their schools than the white families in nearby neighborhoods with a higher property tax base. Some city schools outside of the South were also segregated by law for a number of years after the Civil War. For example, segregated schools were not banned until 1920 in New York City. In general, the quality of education received by black students in these segregated schools was not equal to the quality of education received by white students because schools largely attended by black students were underfunded and provided with fewer resources. Even after the Brown versus Board of Education decision, highly segregated schools fostered through official actions, government implemented housing segregation and school district boundary and assignment policies also remain largely the rule. White protesters against integration, including some that involved violence against African Americans, integrating schools, occurred in different places across the country. For example, in February of 1964, after 460,000 black and Puerto Rican students and their parents called on the New York City Board of Education to integrate majority student of color schools that were so overcrowded they operated on split shifts, with the school day lasting only 4 hours for students and so underfunded that they had inferior facilities and less experienced teachers. 15,000 white New York parents staged a counter-protest. Milton Galamison, a civil rights activist and pastor of Siloam Presbyterian Church in Bedford-Stuyvesant, who helped lead the protest to integrate the school, stated, okay, this was in 1964? Milton, well, yeah, that probably sounds about right. Who helped lead the protest to integrate the school, stated, "Nobody can do these children more harm than these children are being done every day in this public school system." The United States Commission on Civil Rights 1967 study, Racial Isolation in Public Schools, confirmed that nationwide problem, finding that violence against black people continues to be a deterrent to school desegregation. The report also found that black children suffer serious harm when they must attend racially segregated schools, wherever the source of that segregation might be. In 1968, the Kerner Commission warned President Lyndon Johnson that the nation was moving toward two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. As a result of white racism and white supremacist institutions, After a short period of active, coordinated federal effort to enforce desegregation rights from 1965 to 1969, the Nixon administration curtailed enforcement of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. By the 1980s, roughly half of the nation's children of color resided in the 20 or 30 largest school districts. In urban areas, white Americans continue to fight vehemently against integration. For example, in Boston, schools that served black children were poorly equipped and understaffed and badly underfunded. They received about 2/3 the amount of funding received by schools in white neighborhoods. In 1974, after black families filed suit and a court ordered the city to desegregate its schools, white mobs threw bricks, bottles, and eggs at buses carrying black students to majority white schools, injuring 9 children. As white Americans moved into the suburbs, redlining, restrictive covenants, and even violence prevented many African Americans from doing the same. Suburban school district officials drew their boundaries at the city and suburb line, which ensured that black students living in the inner city would be required to attend inner city schools, while white children living in the suburbs attended suburban schools. In larger school districts in cities, unless a court desegregation order was in place, districts continued to assign students to schools based on the schools in their neighborhoods. Because the neighborhoods remained segregated by race, the schools continued to be segregated too. Intentional segregation in housing by federal and local government actors and the drawing of school district boundaries to mirror school segregation and funding inequities was well known and documented. But in 1974, when black parents asked the Supreme Court to order 53 suburban school districts to participate in the desegregation of predominantly black and very under-resourced Detroit city school system, the court said no, because the Supreme Court refused to address the government-supported residential segregation that forced African Americans to attend a small subset of American schools. Integration was stopped at the city-suburb line. Today, the Detroit city school system remains segregated, approximately 80% black and severely underfunded and under-resourced. Then, in 1977, the Supreme Court made it difficult to challenge neighborhood zoning rules, which made it difficult for African Americans to move into largely white residential areas. Professor Derek Bell noted that the federal government and local governments created racial isolated communities, which in turn created single-race schools. And then the Supreme Court insulted these schools from court challenges. After these Supreme Court opinions, lower court judges began to declare school districts desegregated even when the percentage of black students increased after white Americans moved to the suburbs, aided by housing policies that continue to discriminate against African Americans. In general, these federal courts would not find that it was against the law for black students to attend schools that received far less funding and had far fewer resources than those schools attended mostly by white students. By the late 1980s, which was considered the peak of integration, schools remained or were returning to being predominantly white and predominantly non-white. 10 years later, things had gotten worse. On July 17, 2001, Harvard University's Civil Rights Project published a study concluding that school districts across the nation had resegregated or were resegregating at an alarming rate, particularly in the South. The study linked this resegregation to a series of Supreme Court cases decided in the early 1990s, which made it easier for school districts to remain segregated. In 2007, the Supreme Court eliminated school districts' ability to use certain types of voluntary local desegregation plans. 5 years later, a study found that school segregation across the nation was substantially worse than at the high point of desegregation in 1988, and that the typical black student was in a school where almost 2 out of every 3 classmates, 64%, are low income, nearly double the level of schools of the typical white or Asian student. Studies in the last 5 years continue to find that segregated and unequally resourced schools remain the reality for the vast majority of black students and other students of color. However, they also note the extraordinary gains that black students have made in spite of remaining in segregated and unequally funded and resourced schools. Before the Brown decision, less than a fourth of black students had graduated from high school. Now about 9/10 of black students are graduating. Nonetheless, for African Americans to ever attain academic justice, emphasis should be placed not just on the number of African Americans receiving education, but rather on the quality and content of the education received, as stated by Carter G. Woodson. Shout out, Ashe, to the great one and only Carter G. Woodson. For those who don't know, Carter G. Woodson, he wrote a great book called The Miseducation of the Negro. Interjection. If you haven't read it, I highly suggest you read it. Continue. If the education being provided to African Americans is of the wrong kind, the increase in numbers of educated African Americans will be a disadvantage rather than an advantage. All right, fam, we're going to change up the music a little bit. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. Just wanted to read on education. Let's see if we go with this one. All right. No, let's go with this one. Okay. All right. Tracking. After Brown versus Board of Education in districts and schools that were marginally integrated, black students faced segregation by other means. School officials were more likely to place black students in the special education programs and inferior vocational, non-diploma, and alternative school tracks than white students. And school officials were more likely to place white students in the gifted or accelerated programs than black students. This practice, where educators group students by what they view as a student's abilities, is commonly referred to as tracking. Studies have shown that tracking, which continues today, is correlated with race and eliminates the benefits of integration for black students, like access to college classes and high-quality curriculum. Researchers explain that teachers, the vast majority of whom are white, function as primary gatekeepers in gifted and talented identification, and are less likely to refer black students for gifted programs than white students with similar levels of academic achievement. Black students tracked out of the mainstream program are often resegregated in other classrooms within the school or in setting in another school location. Those placed in lower tracks do not receive the same quality of education. They often receive less resources and opportunities. At the October 12, 2021 task force hearing, Professor Rucker Johnson testified to the harms of segregation within schools, including harm to students' health, mental health, and school success and income growth, telling the panel, quote, "Too often, even when we see what looks like diverse schools, there are segregated classrooms," end quote, in racialized tracking. All right, let's see here. Okay, so we're pretty close to 10. Let's see how far we have left here. All right, so let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 14, 15. Okay. All right, we're on this one. Okay. All right, we're gonna read a couple more pages, probably go a little bit past 10 and then call it, and then it'll probably be a part 2. I was gonna see if we could roll through it, but I was like, nah, we will continue later. Anyway, let's continue this session up at least. Unequal and segregated schools persist. As of the early 2000s and through today, the vast majority of Black children remain locked into schools separate from their white peers, and possibly more unequal than the schools that their grandparents had attended under legal segregation. Wow. The U.S. Government Accountability Office found that 60 years after Brown versus Board of Education, Black students are increasingly attending segregated, high-poverty schools where they face multiple educational disparities. The U.S. Department of Education's Office of Civil Rights data between 2014 through 2018 shows the same disparities, large and persistent opportunity gaps, fewer education resources for Black students. Let's see. Yeah. Black students are less likely to attend schools that offer advanced coursework and math and science courses, and less likely to be placed in gifted and talented programs. Another found that Black students who had been on an accelerated math track consistent with their white and Asian peers are disproportionately removed from that track, so that in high school they were no longer being placed with the highest achievers, thereby reinforcing racial inequality. Black students are also more likely to attend schools with large class sizes and teachers with the least amount of experience and qualifications, and that employ law enforcement officers but no counselors. This can particularly be attributed to the fact that urban school districts oftentimes have difficulty attracting and retaining teachers due to the low pay, substandard working conditions, and socioeconomic factors that affect such work environments. Moreover, although many African American students deal with greater social and environmental pressures, schools mostly attended by African Americans fail to place greater emphasis on family counseling and community empowerment. In addition, because Black students more often have less qualified teachers than their white peers, they fall further behind in school, and some researchers believe this is one reason for their excess placement in classes that support students with disabilities. In other words, even though they have only fallen behind because they have not received high quality instruction, schools believe incorrectly that they may have a learning or other disability. These school placement and resource allocation decisions matter for student achievement in post K-12 school outcomes. Severe funding disparities between schools serving white students and those serving Black students persistent as well. Many school districts across the country today continue to be funded primarily by property taxes raised from the school district's local community, even though neighborhoods continue to be segregated by race and income. Federal and state governments have not filled the gaps between high and low income districts. According to a study by Ed Build, nationally, predominantly white school districts get $23 billion more than their non-white peers, despite serving a similar number of children, and there is a 1,500 per student gap between white districts and equally disadvantaged non-white districts. This funding differential matters. More school funding improves education quality. In underfunded schools, students also face health and other risks because of decrepit conditions of their school buildings. Discriminatory use of discipline and the school to prison track. Black students are disproportionately subjugated to exclusionary discipline with devastating consequences. which include significantly higher risk of dropout and juvenile justice involvement. Over the last 3 decades, research has shown that Black students are far more likely than white students to be suspended, even when controlling for income level. This disproportionate discipline also extends to preschool, where Department of Education data from the 2013-2014 school year showed that Black preschoolers made up 18% of preschoolers, but nearly half of all out-of-school suspensions. Overall, Black students made up approximately 16% of enrollment, yet they accounted for 40% of suspensions nationally during the 2013 and 2014 school year. And Black students were 4 times more likely to be suspended than their white peers during the 2017 and 2018 school year. Some researchers have shown that even when you control for the type of student misbehavior, Black students are suspended and expelled at far higher rates than their white peers. In short, when white students and Black students misbehave in the same or similar ways, Black students are more likely to be removed from school for the behavior than their white peers who do the same or similar things. Researchers have also found that the difference in suspension rates between white and Black students accounts for as much as 1/5 of the achievement gap between Black and white students. So if Black students were suspended less, then achievement levels should go up. In addition, Black students are more likely to attend schools with law enforcement on campus and significant security measures, such as metal detectors, random security sweeps and searches, security guards, and security cameras. Having a large police presence and heightened surveillance measures on campus can cause students to feel less bonded to school adults, less engaged in school, more fearful and less trusting of school officials and police, and left with a feeling of alienation because they perceive that adults on campus inherently distrust them. That schools serving mostly Black students have far more law enforcement and fewer counselors is one reason that Black students have more contact with and are more disproportionately referred by schools to law enforcement. Arrests of Black students are higher in schools with a police officer on campus, even when controlling for school-wide academic achievement, racial/ethnic composition, geography, and student misconduct. In the 2015-2016 school year, Black students made up 15% of students enrolled in America's public schools, but 31% of referrals and arrests, and they were twice as likely to be referred or arrested than their white peers in 2018-2019. And Black girls are 3 times more likely than white girls to receive referrals to law enforcement. Wow. There is also evidence that Black students are more likely to be subjected to excessive force by officers in schools. One arrest during school can have severe consequences for a student's future, as it doubles a high school student's likelihood of dropout and increases their likelihood of incarceration as adults. Disproportionately in discipline and the school-to-prison pipeline, such disproportionality has been attributed to biases implicit or otherwise, that school officials may carry into the schoolhouse. Research shows that these biases about Black students, which can result in discriminatory disciplinary decisions, may also exacerbate the achievement gap by decreasing expectations and opportunities. In addition, when students perceive an unfair distribution of punishment, an environment of anxiety is created, with achievement outcomes decreasing and students reporting less of a sense of belonging. Consistent research has identified alternatives to exclusionary discipline, such as school-wide positive behavior interventions and supports and social emotional learning lessons for students that improve educational outcomes faculty cohesion, school safety, and teacher morale. But many school districts have not implemented these alternatives. Furthermore, intergenerational exposure to trauma related to racism has been linked to higher incidences of depression, anxiety, and other mental health conditions in Black communities compared with other groups, including African immigrants, who have not experienced the same multi-generational slavery and institutionalized racism. I guess I'll repeat that again. In Black communities compared with other groups, including African immigrants, who have not experienced the same multi-generational slavery and institutionalized racism. Schools have not consistently provided help, such as mental health services and a trauma-informed approach to education. Instead, schools with large numbers of Black students have increased security and police presence. The impact of the school-to-prison pipeline is also reflected in data over decades showing that nationally, Black youth and adults are incarcerated at a disproportionately higher rate compared with white youth and adults. See Chapter 11, An Unjust Legal System, and Chapter 8, Pathologizing the Black Family, for additional discussions of this topic. Once in the system, education provided to Black students in juvenile facilities is often substandard, and youth in adult facilities may receive no education at all. One of the many tragic consequences of the disproportionate incarceration of Black men is reflected in the academic struggles experienced by young Black boys. The incarceration of Black adult men contributes to the number of Black students in fatherless homes. Moreover, research suggests that the lack of male models in the home has a significantly higher impact on Black male students than it does on Black female students. All right, so let's see there. All right, so let's see how many pages we have. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. Okay, I guess let's stop here since it is 10 o'clock on a Friday. And we'll continue on Chapter 6, Separate and Unequal. On California and California's complicity in this separate and unequal education. So we're gonna stop there, family. So once again, thank you for everyone for coming. Really appreciate y'all. Yeah. Oh man, I'm sorry. Shout out to Kim's baby girl. All right, family. So we will continue this on Monday. But before we go, once again, we will be back in the building on Sunday. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, this Sunday we're going to be doing a special report, 11 a.m. PST in the news. There's a lot going on, family. I mean, I know y'all heard about the debacle in Los Angeles, which we are going to be touching on as well. But you know, there's just a lot of stuff going on. So I just want to thank y'all for coming through. Yeah, appreciate that, Theo. Hope all is well is doing with you, man, and I thank you in LA, right? Yeah, hopefully, brother, you can come through on Sunday and, you know, give us some light on what's going on in LA, brother, because it just seemed like it's just off the chain down there right now. In addition to that, we're actually going to be talking later on this month about the midterm madness, and we're going to actually be going into some Los Angeles candidates as well as some probably Northern California candidates as well. So we're definitely going to be getting into it and you know, trying to figure this whole thing out, see what's going on, family. So All right, on that wonderful note, y'all, you guys have a wonderful night. As usual, be safe, take care of yourself, take care of your family. Knowledge is power, but it's only power if it's not put into action. So get that knowledge, but put it into action, all right? All right, family, on that wonderful note, check us out once again on Sunday, and then once again on October 23rd for Midterm Madness. And we'll be back on Monday for part 2, chapter 6. All right, family, we out. Love, peace, and reparations.
The way it currently stands, forced labor, slavery takes precedence over rehabilitation and public safety.
Oh, by the way, while the Biden administration gives reparations to everyone but free people, look at the billions he has run over to Ukraine.
We don't have black grocery stores because if you think about it now, just to get in that supply chain, it's almost unheard of.
They don't want the truth to get out. Okay? I don't want to know what my family did or what all these people did and all this stuff like that. Okay? You read that 500-page report.
There's this thing called white superiority and black inferiority. That mindset allows all of the behaviors that we've seen across generations, allows for the construction of these policies and practices and systems and structures that continue to oppress us. This is not a handout. This is a debt that is owed.
You know, Allensworth was like the internet of his time in 1904, 1905.
The total black population in California is about 2.6 million, and then of that, the descendants compose about 2.2 million of that. So California, with a multi-billion-dollar surplus, can absolutely afford to satisfy the international terms for reparations, beginning with compensation.
Any financial obstacle that exists that impedes the success of increasing financial prosperity needs to be dealt with and eliminated.
No matter where we've been, no matter what part of this fight we've been in, we've been harmed, and we've had harm done to us specifically.
When I got to Los Angeles, this was some of the worst segregation I'd ever seen. And remember, I'm telling you, I'm from Mississippi.
Because as you can see, I'm giving you broken history right now, you know? But I had to give it to you guys today. I said, no, I got to show them this because it's so precious and nobody really knows about it.
Black people don't have that kind of luxury. Our historically black communities have been redistricted multiple times.
Now listen, if you can't handle the TR roof, don't tune in.